But the passage that I'd like to focus on today particularly is in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. 1 Chronicles 21. And it's a passage that, when we get into it, we're going to see without question, it's talking about an angel, not about God, about an angel. And yet, this angel comes with such power and that we begin to wonder, is this really God? And as a matter of fact, we're going to see that God uses this angel as a picture of God himself. Now, the context is, it begins in verse 1 of 1 Chronicles chapter 21, and Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. Incidentally, this first verse is got a lot of interesting notes about it, or interesting possibilities, because in the original, this originally was found in 1 Samuel chapter 24. 1 Samuel 24, and we better, or 1 Samuel 23, I guess it is. 2 Samuel 24. Thank you, I'll get there. 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, we find exactly the same historical event, only God gives us further insight. We read in verse 1 of 2 Samuel 24, and again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. And when we tie these two verses together, 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, with 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1, we discover in a very interesting way that God uses Satan to accomplish his purposes. Now, we always think, that Satan is an antagonist of God, and God would have nothing to do with Satan. He's a sworn enemy. He is. No question at all about that. But God, of course, is still King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he can even use the wicked of the world in order to accomplish his purposes. Can you think of examples of this? We think, for example, of the Babylonians, that were a wicked nation, totally in rebellion against God, and yet it was God's purpose many years after this account of David, what we're going to read here that concerns David, it was God's purpose to destroy Judah. And so who did he raise up to destroy Judah? The Babylonians. The Babylonians. They became his servant to destroy Judah. God can use the wicked. And incidentally, that's great comfort to us, is it not? When people who are wicked come against us, when we are slandered or vilified or persecuted, or our situation becomes very difficult, and we just sense that almost that Satan himself is really coming against us, that Satan has filled the heart of someone to come against us, we can know, look, God is in control. God is in control, and he is allowing this for his own glory, for his own purposes. And we see this very dramatically as we compare 2 Samuel 24, verse 1, with 1 Chronicles 21, verse 1. Secondly, we have to ask the question, we just can't quickly go by this because it's too provocative. How did Satan provoke David? Can Satan really come into the heart of David and cause him to sin? And the answer is no. No, Satan was a child of God. He was a citizen of God's kingdom. He had been taken out of the dominion of Satan. But how could he work then? Out of the dominion of Christ, or out of the dominion of Satan, he had been translated into the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ. But how could Satan provoke him then? Well, it would have to be through wicked men, through men who were understudies of David. David, after all, was king of Israel, and they got to David. And of course, then the next question we have to ask is, what is the sin? What is the sin? Well, from the context, it appears that the sin was pride, because even the general of David's armies, Joab, said, no, you should not number the people. You should not do this terrible thing. Now, there were times when they were numbered, when God instructed the nation of Israel to be numbered, but the context emphasizes that David was doing this as an act of pride, to see once how great his kingdom had really become. And even his own general Joab warned him, you must not do this. But God has taken his hand off David. He's allowed the people who are under the control of Satan in his rule to influence him, apparently. We have to speculate as to exactly how it happened, so that David acceded to their request in spite of the warnings of Job, because God wanted something against Israel. God was going to bring judgment against Israel. Very interesting context. And so we read in 2 Samuel that for the next 9 months and 10 days, and that's an interesting figure also, which we're not going to get into, but for the next 9 months and 10 days, the armies went out and they numbered all the people of Israel, and they gave the numbers. And that too must have some significance, but we won't get into that either. There are a lot of these things that we should go by, because otherwise we're never going to get back to the book of Hebrews. But the fact is that finally God came to David, and he says, you have sinned. Let's go to verse 9 of 1 Chronicles 21. And the Lord, this is 1 Chronicles 21, verse 9. The Lord spake unto Gad, David's seer, saying, Gad was a prophet, that was a man of God, who prophesied from God to David. Go and tell David, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Well, in fact, before we do this, before we read verse 9, let's get back to verse 7 and 8, so we'll set up the context. God was displeased with this thing, therefore he smote Israel. And then David became aware of this, and David said unto God, I have sinned greatly, because I have done this thing. But now I beseech thee, do away the iniquity of thy servant, for I have done very foolishly. And that's the first reaction of the true believer to sin. We recognize our sin, we break before God, oh God, have mercy on me. Now, the fact is, if you and I sin, can we now expect that God is going to send judgment upon us, as he's going to do upon Israel? The answer is no. Not if we're a child of God. Remember, David is a child of God. David is a child of God. The fact is, if an unsaved person sins, can we in this life expect judgment for that sin? The answer is normally no. In fact, if you go to Psalm 73, you find that the Bible indicates the wicked are fat and sleek, and they do all their wicked things, and yet they seem to have everything going for them. Until we look at them at the end of the world, at Judgment Day. And that is where the scales of justice are balanced. That is where judgment comes. But we're going to see that in this account, God is using the judgment that came upon David and Israel as a picture or figure of the final judgment day. That is, God is going to give an example of the fact that when you sin, the wages of sin is death. And it's particularly focused on national Israel, not on David. David is being used as the vehicle to get Israel into trouble, but nevertheless the focal point is on Israel. And now let's go to verse 9. And the Lord spake unto Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and tell David, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do it unto thee. So Gad came to David and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, choose thee either 3 years of famine, or 3 months to be destroyed before thy foes, while the sword of thine enemies overtaketh thee, or else 3 days, the sword of the Lord, even the pestilence in the land, and the angel of the Lord destroying throughout all the coasts of Israel. Now therefore advise thyself what word I shall bring again to him that sent me. You notice the emphasis on the number 3. 3 things. And then 3 years of punishment, or 3 months of punishment, or 3 days of punishment. Incidentally, in in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel 24, it indicates instead of 3 years of famine, 7 years of famine. So when we combine the two accounts, we find that effectively David was told, you're either going to have 7 or 3 years of famine. That's one alternative. But here, for the purpose of focusing on the number 3, God doesn't mention the 7. The 7 is indicated in 2 Samuel 24. Here, God is highlighting the number 3. He's really focusing on that. And the number 3, if it has any spiritual meaning, what does it mean? It is the purpose of God. And what is the purpose of God insofar as sin is concerned? The purpose of God is to bring damnation. That is absolutely the purpose of God. And God is really underscoring this by the choice of the number 3 here, where He's offering him 3 alternatives, and each one of these 3 alternatives has in an integral part of it the number 3. God doesn't, none of this is accidental, you know. None of this is just because God just kind of thought this would be a nice thing to do. Well, then David said unto Gad, the seer, the prophet, I am in a great strait. I mean, I'm really oppressed by this. Let me fall now into the hand of the Lord, for very great are His mercies, but let me not fall into the hand of men. So the Lord sent pestilence upon Israel, and there fell of Israel 70,000 men. Now that's not a small deal, you know. 70,000 men. Here's a nation that may have had 2 million, 3 million people total. 70,000 men are being destroyed in this pestilence in 3 days. Again, we see a number. And that number, what's the significance of 7 and 1,000? Or 10,000 and 7? The perfection, the completeness of God's plan. In other words, it's God's plan that when He brings judgment, because that is the focal point here, when He brings judgment on the last day because of sin, it will be in perfection. It will be complete. There will be no limitation. There will be no plea bargaining. There will be no paroling. There will be no way of getting out because of a technicality. You know, like people can do today when they have committed a crime. On a technicality, they can be set free, or they can be they won't be sent to prison. No way. The focal point is that when the wages of sin is death, and the death that God has in view is eternal damnation, and it will be meted out, it will be sent out to the full. It will be perfect in all regards insofar as what God's perfect justice demands. And this, of course, should frighten us very much if we're still unsaved. This should just frighten us to the very soles of our feet when we consider that if I would die without Christ, then I might be subject. I would be subject, not might be. If I would die without Christ, I absolutely would be subject to this terrible judgment. It is God's purpose that His judgment will be brought absolutely to the full. All right, and now we see how this destruction is coming about. Verse 15, and God sent an angel unto Jerusalem to destroy it. And as he was destroying, the Lord beheld and repented him of the evil, and said to the angel that destroyed, it is enough, stay now thine hand. And then we get down into verse 16, and David lifted up his eyes and saw the angel of the Lord stand between the earth and heaven, having a drawn sword in his hand, stretched out over Jerusalem. Now, there's no evidence in this context that I've been able to discover that this is anything but an angel of God. And we're seeing in here, as we tie this back into Hebrews chapter 1, verse 4, that God has ascribed to this angel enormous power, enormous responsibility to go into the land of Israel and destroy 70,000 as a consequence of sin.